The bright lights of the interview room made Kethver's scales shimmer nervously as he sat across from the famous galactic journalist Yila Moonwhisper. His forearms fidgeted with the small recording device clipped to his military uniform, the same dark green fabric he had worn during the Zenith War 3 years ago. The space station Harmony Junction buzzed with activity outside the soundproof walls, but inside this room the air felt heavy with anticipation. Yela adjusted her translucent wings and smiled warmly at the reptilian veteran she had interviewed. Hundreds of war survivors from dozens of species, but this particular story had taken months to arrange. Kethver had refused every previous request for an interview about his time serving alongside human forces. Today was different. Today he was ready to talk. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Kethver," Yela said in her melodic voice. "Our viewers across 12 star systems are eager to hear about your experiences during the war." Kethver's sac pulsed slowly, a sign of deep thought among his people. His yellow eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind Yela's shoulder. "I should have spoken sooner," he said quietly. "The galaxy deserves to know what humans are really like in war." The journalist leaned forward slightly. She had heard rumors, whispered stories from other alien veterans who had fought alongside human forces. Most refused to discuss their experiences in detail. Those who did speak often requested their interviews be sealed for decades. "What made you decide to come forward now?" "Because people still don't understand," Kethver replied, his scales shifting to a darker shade of green. "They see humans as just another species, maybe a little aggressive, maybe a little stubborn. They think humans won the war through superior technology or better tactics. They're wrong." Yila activated the recording crystals embedded in the table between them. Across the galaxy, millions of beings would watch this interview, searching for insights into the species that had turned the tide of the greatest war in galactic history. "Tell us about your first assignment with human forces." Kethver closed his eyes for a moment. "I was assigned to the 47th Expeditionary Force as a communications specialist. My government thought it would be good for interspecies relations. We would learn from each other, share knowledge, build lasting friendships." His laugh was bitter. "I was excited. Humans were new to galactic warfare. I thought I could teach them something." "What was your first impression of the human soldiers?" "Normal," Kethver said immediately. "That was the most disturbing part. Colonel Jake Morrison welcomed me personally. He was polite, professional, even friendly. He introduced me to the other officers like I was joining a family. Lieutenant Lisa Grant showed me around the base, explained their procedures, made sure I had everything I needed." The alien veteran's scales rippled with an involuntary shudder. Grant was small by human standards, maybe 5.5 feet tall. She had brown hair tied back in a simple knot and green eyes that seemed to smile when she talked. She asked about my family, my homeworld, my favorite foods. She seemed genuinely interested in learning about my culture. Yai nodded encouragingly. "That sounds pleasant. What changed your perception?" "The first patrol," Kethver said without hesitation. 3 days after I arrived, Grant asked if I wanted to join a routine reconnaissance mission. She said it would help me learn their operating procedures. I agreed. I thought it would be educational. His 4 hands clenched into fists. The patrol included 6 humans and 2 other alien specialists besides myself. We were investigating reports of Zenith scouts near the northern mining facility on Kepler 442b. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy presence, maybe a small observation post. What happened during the patrol? Kethver's throat sac pulsed rapidly now. We found the observation post exactly where intelligence said it would be. But intelligence was wrong about the numbers. Instead of 3 or 4 Zenith scouts, we walked into a full ambush. 27 cybernetic soldiers with advanced plasma weapons, positioned in a narrow canyon with perfect overlapping fields of fire. The journalist waited patiently as Kethver gathered his thoughts. She could see the trauma in his posture, the way his scales had shifted to an almost black color. Standard doctrine for any galactic military force is immediate withdrawal. When facing overwhelming odds, Kethver continued, preserve your forces, call for support, live to fight another day. That's what I expected. That's what any rational species would do, but the humans didn't withdraw? No, Kethver whispered. They didn't withdraw. Grant looked at the enemy. Positions for maybe 10 seconds, then turned to her squad with this completely calm expression. She said, "Okay, team, we've got work to do," like she was discussing the weather. Yilla felt a chill run through her delicate frame. What did they do? Grant divided her people into 3 groups without any apparent fear or hesitation. She sent 2 soldiers to flank left, 2 to flank right, and kept 2 with her for a frontal assault. When I asked about calling for support, she looked at me like I had suggested something unnecessary. Kethvera's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said, "Support is for when you can't handle the problem yourself." Then she smiled that. Same friendly smile she had given me during the base tour. The alien veteran's scales began to shift colors rapidly, cycling through shades of green and brown. I thought she was being reckless. I thought the humans were going to get us all killed. Through inexperience and overconfidence. I had no idea what I was about to witness. Yilla waited, sensing that Kethver needed a moment to compose himself. "The attack began 30 seconds later," he said finally. "What I saw in those next few minutes changed everything I thought I knew. About warfare, about survival, about what it means to be a sentient being facing death." He looked directly at Yilla for the first time since the interview began. That was my first glimpse into what humans really are when they fight. And it terrified me in ways I still don't fully understand. The recording crystals hummed softly as Kethver continued his account. His scales now a deep brown color that indicated intense emotional stress among his species. Yilla watched him carefully, noting how his 4 hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "The Zenith opened fire first," Kethver said, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. "Their plasma weapons lit up the canyon like lightning. The sound was deafening, and the heat made the air shimmer. I dove behind the nearest boulder and expected to see human bodies scattered across the rocks." He paused, his throat sac pulsing. "Slowly, but when I looked up, the humans were still moving. Not running away, not seeking better cover. They were advancing toward the enemy positions while plasma bolts burned the air around them." Yilla leaned forward slightly. "How did they survive the initial barrage?" "That's what I couldn't understand," Kethver replied. "The humans moved like they could see the shots coming before they were fired." Grant rolled left just as a plasma bolt seared the space where she had been standing. Private Alex Turner dropped flat a split second before 3 shots passed over his head. The alien veteran's eyes grew distant as he recalled the scene. At first I thought it was luck. Then I realized they were reading the Zenith body language, watching for the tiny movements that preceded each shot. They were predicting enemy fire patterns while running through a kill zone. What about the flanking maneuvers Grant had ordered? Kethvera's scales rippled with what might have been admiration or terror. The 2 soldiers moving left were Sergeant Danny Park and Corporal Matt Lewis. Park was the unit medic, small and quiet, maybe 25 years old. Lewis was barely out of training, couldn't have been more than 19. He stopped speaking for a moment, his 4 hands clenching and unclenching. Park reached the left flank position and immediately began treating a wounded soldier from another unit who had been caught in the ambush earlier. Plasma fire was still coming down like rain, but Park worked on the wounded man like he was in a safe medical facility. Was Park taking cover while he worked? "No," Kethver said quietly. He was completely exposed, kneeling in the open while enemy fire burned the air around him. His hands never shook. His breathing stayed calm when a plasma bolt hit the rock. Next to his head, he didn't even flinch. Yilla felt her wings flutter nervously. "How is that possible?" "I asked myself the same question," Kethver replied. "And then I saw something that made it worse." Park's medical scanner was beeping steadily, monitoring his vital signs while he worked. His heart rate was 68 beats per minute, normal resting rate for a human. The journalist's translucent features paled. "He wasn't afraid?" "He wasn't." "Just unafraid?" Kethver said. He was functioning at peak efficiency under conditions that should have paralyzed any rational being with terror. While treating the wounded soldier, he was also calling out enemy positions to his squad mates, coordinating their movements and planning their next tactical move. Kethver's scales shifted to an almost black color. Then Lewis reached his flanking position and things got worse. A Zenith soldier with a plasma blade came around the rocks behind him. Lewis should have been dead. What happened? Lewis heard the footsteps and turned just as the blade came down toward his shoulder. Instead of dodging or blocking, he stepped into the attack. The blade went deep into his shoulder, almost to the bone. Yada gasped, her wings trembling. He was killed. No, Kethver said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lewis grabbed the blade with his bare hands while it was still in his shoulder. He pulled the Zenith soldier closer, trapping the weapon, and drove his combat knife into the enemy's weak point behind the neck armor. The alien veteran's forehands were shaking now. The whole thing took maybe 3 seconds. Lewis never made a sound, no scream, no cry of pain, nothing. He just dealt with the threat and moved on to the next enemy position. How badly was he injured? The blade had severed muscle and scraped bone, Kethver replied. Any member of my species would have been unconscious from shock and pain. Lewis applied a field bandage to himself and continued fighting for another 2 hours. Yula stared at him in disbelief. 2 hours with that injury? 2 hours, Kethver confirmed. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was how he treated the injury, like it was a minor inconvenience. He was actually annoyed because the bandage made it harder to aim his weapon properly. The journalist struggled to process what she was hearing. What about the frontal assault Grant was leading? Kethver's scales cycled through several shades of brown and green. Grant and her partner were advancing directly toward the strongest enemy position. 12 Zenith soldiers with overlapping fields of fire, perfect defensive positions, and superior weapons. How did 2 humans expect to defeat 12 Zenith soldiers? They didn't expect to defeat them, Kethver said. They expected to die? Trying. Grant's partner was a young woman named Katie Bell. She couldn't have been more than 22 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes that reminded me of peaceful skies on my homeworld. He paused, his throat sac pulsing rapidly. Bell looked at the enemy positions and said, "This is going to hurt." Then she smiled this bright, cheerful smile and charged straight at them. What was Grant's reaction? Grant nodded like Bell had, suggested a reasonable course of action, and followed her into the attack. Both humans were firing their weapons while running directly toward certain death. They weren't seeking cover or trying to minimize casualties. They were trying to cause maximum damage before they died. Kethver's voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I realized what made humans different. They weren't braver than other species. They weren't more skilled or better trained. They were willing to accept death as an acceptable outcome if it meant completing their mission. Did they survive the assault? Yes, Kethver said, his scales now completely black. But survival wasn't the point. The point was that they had calculated their chances of living through the attack and decided those chances didn't matter. They were going to complete their objective regardless of the personal cost. The alien veteran looked directly at Yella. That was my first lesson about humans in combat. They don't fight to survive. They fight to win. And if winning requires dying, they accept that trade without hesitation. Yella felt a chill run through her delicate frame. How did the ambush end? The Zenith forces retreated, Kethver said simply. 12 cybernetic soldiers with superior weapons and perfect defensive positions retreated from 6 humans. They ran because they realized the humans would never stop coming, never give up, never accept defeat. His forehands were steady now, but his scales remained dark. That night, after the battle, I asked Grant how she could function normally after what they had been through. She looked at me with those same friendly green eyes and said, "Function normally after what?" We had a job to do and we did it. Kethver's voice was barely audible. She genuinely didn't understand why I was disturbed. To her, everything that had happened was just another day at work. Yilla shifted uncomfortably in her chair as she watched Kethver's scales slowly return to their normal green color. The alien veteran had been speaking for nearly an hour, but she sensed they had only scratched the surface of what he had witnessed during the war. That ambush was just the beginning, Kethver said, his voice steadier now. 2 weeks later, I was assigned to a joint operation to retake the mining colony on Zarian Prime. That's when I learned about human psychological warfare. The journalist activated a fresh recording crystal. What made this operation different? The scale, Kethver replied. 3,000 Zenith soldiers had fortified the colony using the miners as human shields. Standard military doctrine called for a siege lasting months, maybe years. Colonel Morrison had a different plan. Cuthbert's throat sac pulsed slowly as he recalled the briefing. Morrison introduced me to Captain Nina Rodriguez, their intelligence officer. She was maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes that seemed to look right through you. She spoke quietly, almost gently, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson. What was her plan? Rodriguez had spent weeks studying Zenith psychology and combat programming, Cuthbert said. She discovered that despite their technological advantages, the Zenith had specific psychological vulnerabilities. They were programmed to respond to certain emotional triggers in predictable ways. The alien veteran's scales rippled with unease. Rodriguez called it Ghost Protocol. She explained that humans would not attack the Zenith positions directly. Instead, they would make the enemy believe they were fighting desperate, emotional beings who were slowly breaking down under pressure. Yaila leaned forward. How did they create that impression? By leaving evidence? Cuthbert said quietly. But not real evidence. Carefully planned false information designed to trigger specific responses in Zenith combat programming. Cuthbert's four hands began to fidget again. I watched human soldiers plant personal items in abandoned buildings. Family photos, children's toys, handwritten letters from home. They would stage these scenes to look like desperate humans had been forced to abandon their most precious possessions. That sounds reasonable for psychological warfare, Yola said. It would have been reasonable if it were true, Cuthbert replied. But the humans weren't desperate or emotional. They were calculating every detail with cold precision. Lieutenant Commander Rob Hayes led a team that would deliberately injure themselves to create false blood trails. The journalist's wings fluttered. Nervously, they hurt themselves intentionally? Hayes would cut his own arm to create authentic human blood samples, Cuthbert said. Then his team would spread the blood in patterns that suggested wounded humans had stumbled through the area. In panic. They created fake diary entries describing fear and desperation, recorded messages that sounded like final goodbyes to loved ones. Cuthbert's scales shifted to a darker shade. The most disturbing part was watching Hayes treat his own injury. He would cut deep enough to produce the blood they needed, then bandage the wound and continue with his mission like nothing had happened. How did the Zenith react to this false evidence? Exactly as the humans predicted, Cuthbert said. Zenith. Combat programming included protocols for dealing with emotionally unstable enemies. When they found the planted evidence, they adjusted their tactics to counter desperate, frightened humans who were making poor decisions. The alien veteran's voice dropped to a whisper, but the humans weren't desperate or frightened. They were setting a trap using the enemy's own psychological programming against them. Yilla felt a chill run through her delicate frame. What happened during the actual assault? The Zenith forces were completely unprepared, Cuthbert replied. They had positioned their defenses to counter emotional, panicked attacks. Instead, they faced coordinated, methodical human tactics that exploited every weakness their false evidence had revealed. Cuthbert's throat sac pulsed rapidly. Captain Rodriguez watched the battle from the command center with the same calm expression she had used during the briefing. When the Zenith lines began to collapse, she turned to me and said, "Psychology is just another weapon system. You study your target, identify the weak points, and apply pressure until something breaks." How long did the battle last? 4 hours, Cuthbert said. What should have been a months-long siege ended in 4 hours, because the humans had manipulated the enemy into defeating themselves. The journalist struggled to process what she was hearing. What happened to the mining colony? The humans rescued every single civilian, Cuthbert replied. Not one miner was killed during the assault. The same soldiers who had coldly manipulated enemy psychology spent the next 3 days providing medical care and comfort to the rescued prisoners. Cuthbert's scales cycled through several shades of green and brown. That's when I realized something. That still disturbs me. The humans weren't becoming monsters to win the war. They were using their capacity for both calculated violence and genuine compassion as tactical resources. Can you explain what you mean? Rodriguez spent weeks planning psychological warfare that would exploit enemy weaknesses without any apparent emotional involvement, Kethver said. But when she met the rescued miners, she cried while helping a wounded child. Both responses were authentic human behavior. The alien veteran's forehands were shaking now. She could compartmentalize her emotions, turning them on and off based on tactical requirements. When she needed to be coldly analytical, she was coldly analytical. When she needed to show genuine compassion, she showed genuine compassion. Yilla stared at him in disbelief. She was manipulating her own emotions. Not manipulating, Kethver corrected. Accessing different aspects of her personality based on mission requirements. She was genuinely caring when caring was useful and genuinely ruthless when ruthlessness was required. What was your reaction to witnessing this? Kethver's scales turned almost black. I began to understand that humans weren't just tactically flexible. They were psychologically flexible in ways that other species couldn't match. They could be whatever the situation required them to be. The alien veteran looked directly at Yilla. After the colony was secured, I asked Rodriguez how she could switch between such different emotional states so easily. She looked at me with those same gentle brown eyes and said, "You do whatever needs to be done." That's what being human means. Did other human soldiers demonstrate similar capabilities? All of them, Kethver said quietly. Every human I served with could access different aspects of their personality based on tactical needs. They could be cold killers in combat and gentle healers in medical situations. They could be ruthless strategists during planning and compassionate friends during downtime. Kethver's voice was barely audible. That night I realized I wasn't serving alongside soldiers who happened to be human. I was serving alongside humans who happened to be soldiers. And the difference was more terrifying than I had imagined. The journalist felt her wings trembling. What did you mean by that distinction? Soldiers from other species become different people during war, Kethver explained. They put aside their normal personalities and adopt warrior mindsets. Humans don't change who they are. They use all aspects of their personality as tools for achieving victory. His scales remained dark as he continued. They don't become monsters to win wars. They use their capacity for both monstrous and noble behavior as tactical resources. That's what makes them so effective and so terrifying. The interview room grew quiet as Kethver gathered his thoughts, his scales gradually shifting back to their normal green color. Yilla could see the emotional toll these memories were taking on the alien veteran, but she knew the galaxy needed to hear this story. The psychological warfare was disturbing, Kethver said slowly, but it wasn't the worst thing I discovered about humans in combat. The worst thing was their biology, Yilla tilted her head curiously. What do you mean by their biology? 6 weeks after the Zarian Prime operation, I was assigned to a long-range reconnaissance mission with Staff Sergeant Kelly Wright and her team, Kethver explained. We were tasked with gathering intelligence behind enemy lines on the planet. Tau Ceti 4, the mission required us to operate without support for 10 days in hostile territory. The alien veteran's throat sac pulsed slowly. Wright was a woman in her early 30s with red hair and green eyes. She had a quiet way of speaking that made you want to listen carefully. During the mission briefing, she explained that we would need to function without sleep for the first 72 hours while crossing enemy patrol zones. How did the team prepare for extended operations without rest? The other alien team members, including myself, were issued military stimulants and scheduled rest periods, Kethver replied. Standard procedure for any multi-species unit operating under extreme conditions. We expected the humans to follow similar protocols. Kethver's scales began to darken slightly. Wright looked at the stimulant dispensers and said her team wouldn't need them. When I asked how they planned to function without sleep for 3 days, she said they would just stay awake. Just stay awake? Yilla repeated. Just stay awake, Kethver confirmed. Like it was the most normal thing in the galaxy. No drugs, no technological assistance, no rotation schedules. They were planning to override their own biology through willpower alone. The journalist's wings fluttered nervously. Did they succeed? They didn't just succeed, Kethver said quietly. They remained alert and effective for the entire 72-hour period. While the rest of us struggled with exhaustion despite our chemical assistance, the humans maintained peak performance. Kethver's four hands clenched into fists. I watched Corporal Matt Lewis navigate through enemy territory during the third night without sleep. His movements were precise, his awareness was sharp, and his decision-making was flawless. He was functioning better than I was with stimulants. How is that possible? I asked Wright the same question, Kethver replied. She explained that humans could access what she called reserves, emergency energy stores that their bodies could tap into when normal limits were exceeded. The alien veteran's scales rippled with unease. She said it wasn't comfortable, but it was doable. She compared it to lifting something heavy. You can lift more when you absolutely have to, even if it hurts. What other biological advantages did you observe? Kethver's voice dropped to a whisper. During the fourth day of the mission, we encountered a Zenith patrol. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it was intense. Private Jake Stone took a plasma blast to the chest that should have been fatal. Was he killed? No, Kethver said, his scales now almost black. The blast burned through his body armor and seared the flesh beneath. I could see exposed muscle and bone. Any member of my species would have died from shock within minutes. The journalist felt her delicate frame shudder. What did Stone do? He applied field medical treatment to himself while continuing to fight, Kethver replied. He used a combat medical kit to seal the wound, injected himself with painkillers, and kept firing his weapon at enemy positions. Kethver's throat sac pulsed rapidly. The most disturbing part was his attitude. He was annoyed that the injury might slow down the mission. He actually apologized to Wright for getting hurt. How long did he continue fighting? 2 hours, Kethver said. He fought effectively for 2 hours with an injury that should have killed him in minutes. When the engagement ended, he asked Wright if he could continue with the mission. Yola stared at him in disbelief. What was Wright's response? She examined the wound and said he could continue as long as he changed his bandages regularly, Kethver replied. She treated a potentially fatal injury like a minor inconvenience that required basic maintenance. The alien veteran's four hands were shaking now. That's when I realized that human pain tolerance wasn't just psychological. They could consciously override their body's warning systems and continue functioning past the point where other species would be unconscious or dead. Did you witness other examples of this ability? Major Chris Sullivan demonstrated it during our extraction, Kethver said. We were captured by a Zenith patrol on the 8th day of the mission. Standard restraint protocols involved electromagnetic shackles that adapted to the prisoner's physiology. Kethver's scales cycled through several shades of brown and green. Sullivan was chained to a wall in a way that would have been impossible for him to escape. The shackles were designed to tighten if the prisoner struggled. How did he escape? He dislocated his own shoulder to create enough room to slip his hand through the shackle, Kethver said quietly. Then he relocated the joint by himself and continued with the escape plan. The journalist's wings were trembling. He deliberately injured himself to escape? He deliberately injured himself, then fixed the injury, then used his temporary disability as a tactical advantage, Kethver corrected. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes. He treated his own body like a tool that could be modified as needed. What was his attitude during this process? Completely matter of fact, Kethver replied. He explained to me later that pain was just information. His body was telling him that something was wrong, but he could choose whether to act on that information or ignore it. Kethver's voice was barely audible. Sullivan said that humans had learned to override their survival instincts when necessary. They could make their bodies do things that biology said were impossible. Did other team members demonstrate similar capabilities? All of them, Kethver said. Every human I served with could push their body beyond what should have been possible. They could function while injured, operate without sleep, and ignore pain levels that would incapacitate other species. The alien veteran looked directly at Yilla. The most terrifying part was that they considered this normal. Wright told me that every human military unit included training on how to override biological limitations. They called it stress inoculation. What did she mean by that? They deliberately exposed themselves to extreme physical and psychological stress during training, Kethver explained. They would practice fighting while injured, operating without sleep, and functioning under conditions that would break other species. Kethver's scales remained dark as he continued. They weren't born with these capabilities. They created them through deliberate conditioning. They turned their own biology into a weapon system that could be deployed when needed. The journalist felt a chill run through her delicate frame. What was your reaction to learning this? I realized that humans weren't just psychologically different from other species, Kethver said. They were biologically different in ways. They had created themselves. They had transformed their own bodies into tools for warfare. His forehands were steady now, but his voice carried a note of deep unease. They had turned survival itself into a choice rather than an instinct. And, that choice was always the same: complete the mission, regardless of the cost to themselves. The recording crystals continued to hum as Kethver's account grew darker, his scales now a deep shade of brown that indicated profound emotional distress. Yilla had interviewed countless war veterans, but none had described anything like what she was hearing about human warfare capabilities. The biological advantages were disturbing enough, Kethver said slowly, but they pale in comparison to human strategic thinking. 3 months before the war ended, I was assigned to strategic planning sessions for Operation Starfall, the final assault on the Zenith homeworld. The alien veteran's throat sac pulsed rapidly. I was given access to these meetings because of my communications expertise. I thought I would be helping coordinate information between different alien species in the coalition. Instead, I witnessed human military planning that changed my understanding of warfare forever. Yila leaned forward slightly. What made their planning different? The scale of their calculations, Kethver replied. The meetings were led by General Patricia Ford, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She spoke in the same calm, professional tone you might use to discuss supply schedules. Kethver's forehands began to fidget nervously. Ford presented casualty projections for the assault like she was reading a weather report. She explained that human forces would accept 40% losses if it meant achieving strategic objectives. 40%? Yilla repeated, her wings fluttering with shock. 40%, Kethver confirmed. Nearly half of all human soldiers involved in the operation would die or be severely wounded. Ford presented this information without any apparent emotional reaction. The alien veteran's scales rippled with unease. When I asked how they could accept such massive losses, Captain Ben Hunter looked at me with complete sincerity and said, "We're already dead? We just haven't stopped moving." Yet, what did he mean by that? Hunter explained that human soldiers began each mission with the assumption that they would not survive, Kethver said quietly. They planned tactics, made decisions, and executed operations based on the belief that death was the most likely outcome. Kethver's voice dropped to a whisper. This wasn't fatalism or despair. It was strategic thinking that removed survival from the equation entirely. They could make decisions that other species couldn't make because they weren't trying to preserve their own lives. How did this affect their planning? It made them willing to consider options that other species would never contemplate. Kethver replied, I watched human planners discuss sacrificing entire battalions to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities. They would send thousands of soldiers to certain death just to test enemy responses. The journalist felt her delicate frame shudder. They used their own people as test subjects? They used their own people as tactical resources, Kethver corrected. Commander Lisa Bell presented a plan that involved deliberately losing 3 major battles to create a false impression of human capabilities. 15,000 soldiers would die to convince the enemy that humans were weaker than they actually were. Kethver's scales turned almost black. Bell discussed these deaths with the same calm professionalism she used for supply requisitions. When I asked how she could plan the deaths of so many people, she said, "Every death serves a purpose." That's what makes it acceptable. Did the other human officers support these plans? All of them, Kethver said. Every human in those planning sessions understood that victory required sacrifices that other species couldn't make. They were willing to accept any level of casualties if it meant achieving their strategic objectives. The alien veteran's throat. Sack pulsed rapidly. The most disturbing part was their contingency planning. They had prepared strategies for scenarios that other species refused to even consider. What kind of scenarios? Complete planetary sterilization, Kethver said quietly. If the assault on the Zenith homeworld failed, humans were prepared to destroy the entire planet rather than accept defeat. Yilla stared at him in horror. They would commit genocide? They would commit genocide if it was tactically necessary, Kethver replied. Major Scott Davis presented detailed plans for biological weapons that would eliminate all life on Zenith worlds. He discussed the complete extinction of an entire species like he was planning a training exercise. The journalist's wings were trembling now. How could they consider such actions? Because they viewed warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a conflict to be managed, Kethver explained. If the problem required the extinction of the enemy species, they were prepared to accept that solution. Kethver's four hands were shaking. Davis told me that humans had learned to separate tactical requirements from moral preferences. They could do whatever was necessary to win, regardless of their personal feelings about those actions. Did they actually implement these extreme plans? They didn't need to, Kethver said. The Zenith analyzed human strategic thinking and realized that continued resistance would result in their complete extinction. They surrendered not because they were defeated militarily, but because they understood that humans would never stop fighting until every Zenith was dead. The alien veteran's voice was barely audible. The enemy surrendered because they realized humans were willing to accept any cost to achieve victory, including the cost of becoming monsters. What was your reaction to witnessing these planning sessions? I began to understand that humans didn't just fight differently from other species, Kethver replied. They thought about warfare in ways that other species couldn't comprehend. They could make decisions that required abandoning everything we consider civilized behavior. Kethver's scales remained dark as he continued. After one particularly disturbing session, I asked General Ford how she could plan such extreme actions while maintaining her humanity. She looked at me with those same calm blue eyes and said, "Humanity isn't about what you're willing to do. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect what matters." What did she mean by that? She meant that humans were willing to sacrifice their own moral comfort to achieve strategic objectives, Kethver explained. They could become monsters if being monsters was what victory required. The journalist felt a chill run through her. Delicate frame. Did you believe they were monsters? That's what made it so terrifying, Kethver said. They weren't monsters. They were still recognizably human, even while planning actions that would horrify other species. They maintained their capacity for kindness, humor, and compassion while simultaneously preparing for genocide. Kethver looked directly at Yalla. I realized that human strategic thinking wasn't about becoming evil. It was about accessing whatever aspects of their nature were required to win. They could be gentle healers or ruthless exterminators based on tactical needs. How did this realization affect you? It made me understand that humans weren't just effective soldiers, Kethver replied. They were a species that could adapt their entire moral framework to meet strategic requirements. They could redefine right and wrong based on what victory demanded. His voice was barely audible. That's when I realized that the most dangerous thing about humans wasn't their weapons or their tactics. It was their ability to become whatever the situation required them to become, while still believing they were doing the right thing. The recording crystals dimmed slightly as Kethver reached the final portion of his account, his scales now a deep black that reflected the weight of what he was about to reveal. Yilla had listened to hours of testimony that challenged everything. She thought she knew about human nature, but she sensed the most important revelations were still to come. The war ended 3 days after Operation Starfall began, Kethver said quietly. The Zenith sent surrender terms before human forces even reached their homeworld. They had analyzed human strategic thinking and concluded that continued resistance would result in their complete extinction. The alien veteran's throat sac pulsed slowly. I was present when Colonel Morrison received the surrender message. He read it once, nodded, and said, Good, now we can get back to being human. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. What did he mean? Yella asked. I found out during the occupation period that followed, Kethver replied. I stayed with human forces for 6 months after the war ended, expecting to see the same ruthless efficiency they had demonstrated during combat. Instead, I witnessed something that disturbed me even more than their warfare capabilities. Kethver's forehands were steady now, but his voice carried a note of deep confusion. The humans transformed overnight from terrifying war machines into gentle peacekeepers. The same soldiers who had planned genocide were now building schools and hospitals for former enemy populations? How was that possible? Sergeant Danny Park, the medic who had treated wounded soldiers while under fire, returned to civilian life and became a pediatric nurse, Kethver explained. He worked with Zenith children who had been orphaned by the war, showing them the same calm compassion he had demonstrated during combat. The alien veteran's scales rippled with bewilderment. I watched Park comfort a young Zenith girl who was afraid of humans. He held her gently, spoke to her in soft tones, and spent hours teaching her to trust him. The same hands that had killed. Enemy soldiers were now healing their children. What about the other soldiers you had served with? Lieutenant Lisa Grant started a small business growing flowers on her homeworld, Kethver said. The woman who had charged into enemy fire without hesitation spent her days nurturing delicate plants and creating beauty. Kethver's voice dropped to a whisper. When I visited her farm, Grant showed me her greenhouse with the same enthusiasm she had once shown for tactical planning. She talked about soil composition and growth cycles with the same analytical precision she had used to plan attacks. Did you ask her about this transformation? I asked all of them, Kethver replied. They looked at me like I was asking an obvious question. Grant said, the war is over. Now we do something else, like switching from warfare to flower growing. Was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The journalist felt her wings flutter with confusion. They didn't seem affected by their wartime experiences. They were affected, Kethver corrected. But they had compartmentalized those experiences in ways that other species couldn't understand. They could access their capacity for violence when it was needed and set it aside when it wasn't. Kethver's scales began to shift to a lighter shade of brown. I had a long conversation with Colonel Morrison before I left human space. He explained that humans had evolved as persistence hunters, creatures that would methodically pursue prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. What did that have to do with their warfare capabilities? Morrison said that this hunting instinct hadn't disappeared with civilization, Kethver explained. It had simply been refined and redirected. During war, humans became persistence, hunters tracking enemy forces. During peace, they became persistence builders creating better societies. The alien veteran's throat sac pulsed thoughtfully. He told me that humans had learned to fight countless wars among themselves before joining the galactic community. What other species considered extreme battlefield behavior was simply normal human activity. Did Morrison believe humans were naturally violent? Morrison said humans weren't naturally violent or naturally peaceful, Kethver replied. They were naturally adaptive. They could become whatever the situation required them to become, then transition to something else when circumstances changed. Kethver looked directly at Yila. That's when I realized what made humans truly terrifying. It wasn't their weapons or their tactics or their willingness to die for victory. It was their ability to remain fundamentally human while demonstrating capabilities that would destroy other species. What do you mean by that? Other species become different people during war, Kethver explained. They put aside their normal personalities and adopt warrior mindsets. When the war ends, they struggle to return to their original selves. The alien veteran's scales were now a normal green color, but his voice carried a note of awe. Humans don't change who they are during war. They use all aspects of their personality as tools for achieving objectives. They can be gentle healers and ruthless killers at the same time because both capabilities are part of being human. How did this realization affect your understanding of humanity? I understood that humans joined the galactic community as veterans of warfare that other species couldn't comprehend, Kethver said. They had already learned to wage war without losing their capacity for peace. To commit violence without becoming violent, to plan genocide without becoming monsters. Kethfer's four hands were completely still now. The most terrifying and reassuring thing about humans is that they never stop being human. Even in the darkest moments of warfare, they remain moral, caring individuals while demonstrating capabilities. That would traumatize other species. What message do you want to convey to the galactic community? That humans make excellent allies precisely because they would make terrible enemies, Kethfer replied. Their capacity for violence isn't what makes them dangerous. It's their capacity to remain rational while employing that violence. The alien veteran's voice was steady now, carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Humans can wage total war while maintaining their moral framework. They can plan extinction campaigns while preserving their capacity for kindness. They can become monsters when necessary while remaining recognizably human. Do you believe this? Makes them trustworthy? I believe it makes them human, Kethfer said simply. And after serving alongside them for a year, I understand that being human means being capable of anything that survival requires, while never losing sight of what makes survival worth achieving. Kethfer looked directly into the recording crystals, addressing the galactic audience. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the smartest or the most technologically advanced. But they are the most adaptable, and that adaptability extends to every aspect of their existence. What is your final assessment of humanity's place in the galactic community? Humans are what every species becomes when pushed to the absolute limit of survival, Kethfer replied. The difference is that humans have learned to access those capabilities without being pushed to that limit. They can become whatever they need to become, whenever they need to become it. The alien veteran's scales were now their normal bright green color. That's what makes them terrifying as enemies and invaluable as allies. They have mastered the art of becoming monsters while remaining human, of waging war while preserving peace, of planning death while celebrating life. Kethfer's voice was barely audible as he concluded. The most important thing the galaxy needs to understand about humans is that they are not a species that learn to fight. They are a species that learn to survive anything, including the necessity of fighting. And that survival instinct is tempered by something even more powerful, their refusal to let survival cost them their humanity. The recording crystals fell, silent as Kethfer finished his account, leaving the galaxy to grapple with the implications of what they had just learned about their human allies.